I'm Abigail, 38 years old, with what I thought was a perfect life, a successful 20-year marriage to Richard, a wonderful son named Thomas, and a future daughter-in-law I adored. Until that Tuesday afternoon when I walked in on them, my husband and my son's fiancée, in our bed. The pregnancy announcement came next, then divorce papers. But what happened after I walked away? That's the story they never expected. If you're joining me today, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, hit that like button and subscribe to hear how I rebuilt my life from the ashes of betrayal. Richard and I met during our sophomore year at the University of Wisconsin. I was studying communications with dreams of journalism, while he was pursuing accounting with plans to join a prestigious firm. We were introduced at a mutual friend's birthday party, and despite being complete opposites, me outgoing and creative, him structured and analytical, we clicked instantly. Our first date was at a small Italian restaurant just off campus. Richard had calculated exactly how much he needed to save from his part-time library job to afford dinner for both of us. That blend of thoughtfulness and practicality made me fall for him. Within 6 months, we were inseparable. After graduation, we moved to Chicago, where Richard secured an entry-level position at Anderson Financial, while I worked at a small marketing agency. We lived in a tiny apartment, saved every penny, and dreamed about our future. Richard would spend evenings at our rickety kitchen table studying for his CPA exams, while I pitched article ideas to local publications. 2 years later, he proposed at the same Italian restaurant where we had our first date. He'd arranged for the owner to recreate our original meal. The ring wasn't extravagant, a modest diamond that represented all his savings, but to me it was perfect. Our wedding was small but beautiful, held in my parents' backyard in Madison. We danced under string lights as our families celebrated around us. I remember my father whispering, "He's a good man, Abigail. He'll take care of you." And for nearly 2 decades, I believed he had. We waited 5 years before having Thomas. Those were years of career building and saving for a house in the suburbs. When I discovered I was pregnant, Richard converted our home office into a nursery, meticulously painting the walls a soft blue and assembling the crib with engineering precision. Thomas arrived on a snowy January morning. 7 pounds, 6 ounces of perfection with Richard's chin and my green eyes. The moment I held him, everything shifted. My career aspirations in marketing took a back seat as motherhood became my primary focus. When Thomas started kindergarten, I decided to pursue real estate, a career that would allow me flexibility while still contributing to our family finances. Richard supported me through licensing classes and celebrated my first sale with champagne on our back deck. Thomas grew into an amazing young man, athletic like his father, playing varsity baseball in high school, but with my creative streak that emerged through photography and writing for the school newspaper. He was our pride and joy, excelling academically and setting his sights on medical school from an early age. Richard's career flourished. He became a senior partner at his firm, specializing in high-net-worth client portfolios. Our financial security allowed us to pay for Thomas's college education without loans, take family vacations to Europe, and begin planning for an early retirement. Our family dynamic was solid. Sunday dinners were sacred, a time when phones were put away and we connected over home-cooked meals and conversations about our week. Richard taught Thomas to change oil in the car and invested in the stock market. I shared my love of classic literature and encouraged his volunteer work at the local hospital. When Thomas called from university 3 years ago, his voice brimming with excitement about a girl named Hannah he'd met in his advanced biology class, I was thrilled. Richard and I had been waiting for our son to find someone special. The first time Thomas brought Hannah home for Thanksgiving, I was immediately charmed. She was petite with honey blonde hair, intelligent and articulate, majoring in biology with plans for pharmaceutical research. She helped me in the kitchen, asked thoughtful questions about our family photos, and seemed genuinely interested in our lives. Richard was equally impressed, especially when Hannah engaged him in a lengthy discussion about investment strategies for young professionals. She's a keeper, he whispered to me that night as we prepared for bed. Smart as a whip and good for Thomas. Over the next 2 years, Hannah became a fixture in our lives. She joined us for holidays, family vacations, and casual weekend visits. I taught her my grandmother's secret apple pie recipe, shared stories about Thomas's childhood, and listened to her dreams of working for a major pharmaceutical company. When Thomas announced they were engaged last summer, we were ecstatic. He proposed at the Botanical Gardens where they had their first date with a vintage ring that Hannah had once admired in an antique shop window. The engagement party at our home was perfect, friends and family gathering to celebrate what seemed like an ideal match. Wedding planning began immediately. Hannah wanted a June ceremony after her graduation, giving us almost a year to prepare. I was delighted when she asked me to help choose venues, flowers, and her dress. We created a shared online folder for ideas and spent weekends visiting potential reception locations. Looking back, there were signs I should have recognized. Richard suddenly taking an interest in wedding details when he'd never cared about such things before. Hannah texting him directly about decisions instead of including me. The way she'd touch his arm when laughing at his jokes, or sit unnecessarily close during family movie nights. But I trusted completely. Why wouldn't I? This was Richard, my partner of 20 years, father of my child, the man who still brought me coffee in bed every Sunday morning. And Hannah was going to be my daughter-in-law, a sweet girl who sent me thoughtful cards on my birthday and remembered my favorite flowers. How could I have known that the two people I welcomed with open arms would betray me in the most devastating way possible? The wedding planning took over much of my free time. I created spreadsheets, contacted vendors, and coordinated with Hannah's mother in Colorado. Hannah began stopping by our house several times a week, often when Thomas was busy with lab work or study groups. I thought nothing of it. I was happy to have one-on-one time with my future daughter-in-law. Richard started coming home later than usual. His standard 6 o'clock arrival stretched to 7, then 8. He blamed it on a new client with complicated tax situations, a reasonable explanation given his position at the firm. When I called his office one evening and his assistant said he'd left hours earlier, he claimed he'd been meeting clients at their homes. Small changes in his behavior appeared. He began using a new cologne, something spicier than his usual clean, subtle scent. His phone, once casually left on countertops or beside his recliner, was suddenly password protected and rarely out of his possession. When I mentioned these changes, he dismissed my concerns with practiced ease. "You're overanalyzing, Abby," he'd say with a chuckle that seemed slightly forced. "Tax season has me stressed, that's all." Hannah's behavior shifted subtly, too. She began dressing differently when coming to our home. More makeup, carefully styled hair, form-fitting clothes that seemed excessive for casual wedding planning sessions. Her questions about Richard increased his schedule, his interests, his favorite foods. One afternoon, I returned from the bathroom to find them huddled over wedding budget spreadsheets, their heads nearly touching. They jumped apart when I entered, Hannah's cheeks flushing, as Richard cleared his throat and began discussing centerpiece costs with unusual animation. During a family dinner celebrating Thomas's acceptance to his top-choice medical school, I noticed Hannah refilling Richard's wine glass. With attentive precision, their fingers brushing longer than necessary. When dessert was served, she'd somehow rearranged seating, so she sat beside my husband instead of her fiancé. Thomas remained oblivious, absorbed in excited conversations about his medical school plans and arranging their future living situation near the university. His trust in both his father and fiancée was absolute. His focus split between his studies and their future together. My best friend Lauren noticed what I was trying to ignore. During our monthly lunch at our favorite bistro, she gently broached the subject. "Is everything okay between you and Richard?" she asked, stirring her iced tea with unusual concentration. "Of course," I replied automatically. "Why do you ask?" "At your barbecue last weekend, I saw something that bothered me. Hannah and Richard by the grill. The way they were looking at each other when they thought no one was watching." My stomach tightened, but I forced a laugh. "Lauren, that's ridiculous. She's marrying our son. Richard is just being welcoming. Lauren reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I hope I'm wrong, Abby. But as your friend for 25 years, I needed to say something. That night I confronted Richard as he prepared for bed, forcing myself to ask the question that had been festering. Is there something going on between you and Hannah? His reaction was immediate and theatrical. Wide eyes dropped jaw followed by indignant anger. Are you serious right now? She's going to be our daughter-in-law. She's Thomas's fiancée. How could you even think such a thing? He turned the conversation around, questioning my mental health, suggesting I was jealous of Hannah's youth or insecure about our marriage. By the time he finished, I was apologizing to him, feeling guilty for harboring such thoughts. Maybe you need to talk to someone professional. He suggested, his tone softening to concern. These paranoid thoughts aren't healthy. I retreated, questioning my own perceptions. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe the stress of wedding planning and Thomas's impending move for medical school was affecting my judgment. Maybe the natural anxieties of middle age were manifesting as irrational suspicions. Meanwhile, Hannah became increasingly bold. She began calling Richard directly about wedding decisions, sidestepping me entirely. She'd reference private conversations they'd apparently had, discussions about venues or catering that somehow occurred without my knowledge. When I'd enter a room where they were talking, their conversation would shift abruptly, artificial smiles appearing on both faces. We were just discussing the rehearsal dinner menu. Hannah would explain, her voice slightly higher than normal. Richard has such great taste. I began doubting myself, wondering if I was manufacturing problems where none existed. Richard had always been faithful. Hannah loved Thomas. The alternative was unthinkable. But somewhere deep inside, beyond the self-doubt and rationalization, a quiet voice was growing louder. Something wasn't right in my perfect family. April 16th. The date is permanently etched in my memory. The day my carefully constructed life imploded. I'd been scheduled to show a luxury lakefront property to potential buyers, an appointment I'd been excited about for weeks. The commission alone would have covered a significant portion of the honeymoon gift we planned for Thomas and Hannah. But 30 minutes before the showing, my clients called to reschedule due to a family emergency. Initially annoyed at the cancellation, I decided to use the unexpected free time to work on wedding seating arrangements at home. Richard should have been at the office until his usual late hour. Thomas was at university, immersed in final exams before graduation. The house would be quiet, perfect for focusing on the detailed task. As I turned onto our street, I immediately noticed Richard's silver BMW in the driveway. My first thought was concern. Richard never came home during workdays unless something was wrong. I checked my phone, surprised I hadn't received a call or text explaining his presence. Then I spotted another car parked across the street. Hannah's white Volkswagen. The knot in my stomach tightened. Perhaps they were working on some wedding surprise for Thomas or me. That would explain the secretive behavior I'd been noticing. I entered quietly through the garage door, hearing no sounds from the main floor. Calling out would have been natural, but something stopped me. An instinct I can't explain, as if some part of me already knew. The house felt different, tense, waiting. I set my purse and keys on the kitchen counter, noticing 2 wine glasses beside the sink. Richard's suit jacket was draped over a dining chair, Hannah's lightweight cardigan beside it. Then I heard it. A sound from upstairs, our bedroom. A laugh. Hannah's laugh followed by a lower murmur I recognized as Richard's voice. Time seemed to slow as I moved toward the staircase. Each step felt like moving through water, my body heavy with dread and denial, fighting a desperate battle in my mind. 17 stairs to the second floor. I counted each one a futile attempt to delay what was coming. Outside our bedroom door, I froze. The sounds were unmistakable now. Whispers, rustling, the rhythmic creak of our bed. The bed where Richard and I had slept for 15 years, where we'd nursed Thomas through childhood fevers, where we'd exchanged anniversary gifts and Sunday morning coffees. I don't remember deciding to open the door. One moment I was standing in the hallway, the next, My hand was turning the knob, pushing the door open to reveal my husband and my son's fiancée entwined in our bed. They didn't notice me immediately. Those seconds, watching them together, processing the reality before they became aware of my presence, were perhaps the most surreal of my life. Richard's wedding ring glinting as his hand moved across Hannah's bare skin. Her engagement ring from Thomas catching the afternoon light. Then Hannah's eyes flicked toward the doorway. She saw me and her expression transformed from pleasure to horror. She gasped, clutching the sheet to her chest, her face draining of color. "Abigail." Richard jerked away from Hannah, scrambling for clothes. "This isn't—" I can explain, but there was no explanation that could undo what I'd witnessed. No words that could erase the image now permanently seared into my memory. My husband. My future daughter-in-law. The ultimate betrayal of not just me, but our son. The room spun. I gripped the doorframe, physical pain spreading through my chest as if my heart were literally breaking. 20 years of marriage, thousands of shared moments, all obliterated in an instant. "Abigail, please." Hannah's voice was small tears already streaming down her face. "It just happened. We never meant to." Just happened. My voice didn't sound like my own. "In our bed, with my son's engagement ring on your finger." Richard was pulling on his pants, his movements frantic. "Abby, it was a mistake. A terrible, awful mistake. The stress of work, the wedding planning, it doesn't mean anything." "Doesn't mean anything." I repeated the words, tasting like poison. "Then why is her car parked outside in broad daylight? Why are there wine glasses downstairs? This wasn't a momentary lapse, Richard. This was planned." Hannah was sobbing now, clutching the bedsheet around her naked body. "Please don't tell Thomas. Please, we can fix this. It won't happen again." The audacity of her plea broke something inside me. Fix this. As if this were a broken vase or a missed appointment. "Get out of my house," I whispered, then louder. "Get out of my house." Richard approached me, reaching for my arm. "Abby, let's talk about this rationally. We need to think about Thomas." "Don't you dare speak his name," I hissed, jerking away from his touch. "Don't pretend you were thinking about our son while you were in bed with his fiancée." I turned and fled to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. My hands shook so badly I could barely operate my phone, but somehow I managed to call Lauren. "I need you," was all I could say before breaking down completely. Outside the bathroom door, I could hear Richard pleading, his voice alternating between apologetic and defensive. Hannah's sobs provided a continuous backdrop. My phone buzzed. "Thomas." A text about dinner plans for the weekend. My son's studying for finals, completely unaware that his father and fiancé had just destroyed our family. How could I tell him? How could I shatter his world with this unbearable truth? Through the bathroom door, I heard Richard's attempts at damage control. "This was a one-time mistake," he insisted. "We got carried away. It meant nothing." His words only fueled my anger. A one-time mistake. The wine glasses downstairs, her car in broad daylight. The comfortable way they'd been together. This wasn't their first encounter. By the time Lauren arrived 20 minutes later, Hannah had dressed and left, and Richard was sitting on our bed with his head in his hands. Lauren helped me pack an overnight bag while Richard continued his stream of excuses and apologies. "I won't be coming back." I told him, my voice steadier than I felt. "Not tonight, not ever." As Lauren drove me away from the home I'd loved for 15 years, I felt myself fragmenting. Wife, mother, betrayed woman, no longer certain which identity would survive. I spent that night at Lauren's guest room, alternating between numbness and waves of physical pain that left me gasping. Richard called 17 times. I silenced my phone after the third call, unable to hear his voice without feeling physically ill. "What do I tell Thomas?" I asked Lauren as she brought me tea I couldn't drink and food I couldn't eat. "How do I tell my son that his father and his fiancée—" I couldn't even finish the sentence. The betrayal was too enormous, too grotesque to put into words. You don't have to decide tonight, Lauren said gently, sitting beside me on the bed. Give yourself time to process. But time was a luxury I didn't have. Thomas called again the next morning, concerned when I didn't answer his text. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message with tears streaming down my face. Hey, Mom. Just checking if we're still on for dinner Saturday. Hannah's excited to show you the sample centerpieces. Love you. Richard's calls and texts evolved throughout the day. Early messages were apologetic. Please come home so we can talk about this. By afternoon, they shifted to defensive. This wouldn't have happened if you hadn't been so absorbed in wedding planning. By evening, he was bargaining. We need to handle this as a family for Thomas's sake. Not once did he say he loved me. Not once did he acknowledge the depth of his betrayal. Hannah tried reaching out too, a tearful voicemail begging me not to make any hasty decisions. As if discovering my husband and my future daughter-in-law in my bed was something that required careful consideration rather than immediate action. 3 days after the discovery, I finally agreed to meet Thomas at a coffee shop halfway between Lauren's house and his campus apartment. I still hadn't decided what to tell him. The truth would devastate him, but lies would only delay the inevitable. Mom, what's going on? He asked immediately. His brow furrowed with worry. Dad's acting weird. You're staying with Lauren and Hannah's been crying for days but won't tell me why. Looking at my son, Richard's chin, my eyes, his whole life ahead of him, I couldn't bring myself to destroy his world. Not yet. Your father and I are having some serious problems, I said carefully. I need some time away to think. Thomas looked stunned. But you guys never fight. Is this about the wedding? Is it too much stress? It's complicated, honey. Nothing for you to worry about right now with finals coming up. He didn't believe me, of course. Thomas had always been perceptive, but he respected my obvious reluctance to elaborate. Is there anything I can do? He asked, reaching for my hand across the table. I squeezed his fingers, marveling at how my little boy had grown into this compassionate young man. Focus on your exams. Everything else can wait. The temporary reprieve came to an abrupt end a week later. I'd consulted with Janet Feldman, a divorce attorney recommended by Lauren's sister. I'd moved from Lauren's guest room to a small furnished apartment with a month-to-month lease. I'd begun the painful process of separating my life from Richard's, banking information, credit cards, personal documents. I returned to our house while Richard was supposed to be at work planning to collect more of my belongings. I'd barely entered when I heard voices from the kitchen. Richard and Hannah again. My first instinct was to leave to avoid another confrontation. But this was still legally my home, and I needed my things. I steeled myself and walked toward the kitchen. They were sitting at the breakfast bar, not touching, but clearly intimate in their conversation. Both looked up when I entered, Hannah's eyes red-rimmed from crying, Richard's face haggard from lack of sleep. Abigail. Richard stood quickly. I'm glad you're here. We need to talk. I'm just collecting some more clothes, I said flatly. There's nothing to discuss. Hannah stood too, one hand protectively covering her stomach. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable. My eyes fixed on that hand, understanding dawning with horrific clarity. You're pregnant, I whispered. She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I found out 2 days ago. The room tilted dangerously. I grabbed the counter to steady myself. Is it? I couldn't finish the question. It's mine, Richard confirmed, his voice strained. We've done a timeline based on when it happened. When it happened. As if their affair had been a singular event rather than an ongoing betrayal. Thomas doesn't know yet, Hannah added quickly. We wanted to talk to you first to figure out how to handle this as adults. As adults. The same people who had behaved with the reckless disregard of teenagers were now appealing to adult responsibility. Fix this, Abby, Richard pleaded, using the diminutive only he called me. Help us figure out a solution. A solution, I repeated incredulously. To the fact that you impregnated our son's fiancée, what solution do you imagine exists? Maybe, Hannah began tentatively, maybe we don't have to tell Thomas the whole truth. We could say the wedding planning is too stressful that we need to postpone. The audacity of her suggestion broke through my shock. You want me to help you lie to my son? To cover up your betrayal so you can what? Continue cheating until you figure out your next move. Of course not, Richard interjected. But Thomas's future is at stake here. His mental health, his medical school performance. If there's a way to minimize the damage— You should have thought about the damage before sleeping with his fiancée, I said coldly. I'm filing for divorce, Richard, and Thomas deserves the truth, however painful. Richard's face hardened. If you do that, you'll destroy this family completely. I didn't destroy this family, I replied, a strange calm settling over me. You did. Both of you. I left without collecting my clothes, driving straight to Janet Feldman's office where I instructed her to file divorce papers immediately. Then I called Thomas and asked him to meet me at my apartment. The time for protecting him from the truth had ended. Telling my son that his father had betrayed him with the woman he loved was the hardest conversation of my life. His initial disbelief gave way to anger, then to a pain so profound it was physically visible, his body seeming to collapse in on itself as he processed the unimaginable. "The baby?" he asked after long minutes of silence, his voice barely audible. "Is your father's?" I confirmed gently. Thomas stood abruptly pacing my small living room like a caged animal. All this time, while I was telling her about medical school plans, about our future together, she was sleeping with my father. I had no answers that could ease his pain, no maternal wisdom to offer in the face of such a betrayal. I could only witness his suffering, my own heart breaking anew for my child. When he left my apartment that night, I feared for his well-being. But Thomas had always been stronger than anyone gave him credit for. Instead of confronting Richard or Hannah in anger, he sent them each a text, 2 sentences that spoke volumes about the man he had become despite his father's failings. "I know everything. Don't contact me again." Then he threw himself into his final exams, channeling his pain into academic focus, shutting out the chaos his father and ex-fiancée had created. The divorce I had initiated was just the beginning of what would become my journey back to myself. The divorce process revealed sides of Richard I never imagined existed in the man I'd been married to for 20 years. His initial pleas for reconciliation quickly transformed into aggressive legal maneuvers when he realized I wouldn't be manipulated. "Mr. Peterson is offering a settlement that's quite generous given the circumstances," his attorney stated during our first mediation session, sliding a document across the table. Janet, my lawyer, reviewed it briefly before pushing it back. "If by generous you mean insultingly inadequate, then yes," she replied coolly. "Mrs. Peterson gave up career advancement to support your client's professional growth and raise their son. She's entitled to far more than this." Richard leaned forward, his expression hard. "Be reasonable, Abigail. You're the one choosing to end this marriage." "I'm choosing to respond appropriately to your infidelity with our son's fiancée," I corrected, meeting his gaze without flinching. "There's a difference." The battle lines were drawn. Richard's parents, who had always treated me like a daughter, suddenly sided completely with their son. His mother called me one evening, her voice trembling with emotion. "Marriages hit rough patches, Abigail," she said. "Richard made a terrible mistake, but divorcing him punishes everyone. Think about our family." "I am thinking about family," I responded. "Specifically about our son, whose fiancée is now pregnant with his father's child." The silence that followed told me she hadn't known the full story. Richard had presented himself as the victim of an unforgiving wife. Our friends divided into camps. Some, like Lauren and her husband, stood firmly beside me. Others suggested forgiveness, reconciliation, as if betrayal of this magnitude was something that could be overcome with enough therapy and goodwill. "People recover from affairs all the time," said Diane, a woman I'd considered a close friend for 15 years. "This wasn't just an affair," I tried to explain. "He slept with our future daughter-in-law. They created a child that should have been our grandchild, but is instead our son's half-sibling. How does one recover from that? Diane had no answer, but her continued social media friendship with Richard spoke volumes. Thomas moved into my apartment temporarily, deferring his medical school start date by 1 semester. Having him close was both a comfort and a heartache. Watching my son process his dual betrayal while trying to navigate my own grief was excruciating. He alternated between determined stoicism and moments of raw pain that left him sleepless and hollow-eyed. "Did I miss signs?" he asked one night as we sat on my small balcony, the city lights blurring through unshed tears. "Was there something I should have seen?" "No," I said firmly, reaching for his hand. "Their choices reflect their character failings, not yours. You trusted the people who should have been most worthy of that trust." Meanwhile, the divorce proceedings grew increasingly contentious. Richard's apparent contrition vanished entirely when Janet discovered he'd been transferring funds to personal accounts for months before the affair was revealed. "He's been planning an exit strategy," Janet explained, showing me the financial records. "These transfers began 8 months ago, right around the time Hannah started visiting your home regularly for wedding planning." The implications were staggering. The betrayal wasn't just physical, but calculated, premeditated. Richard had been preparing financially even while maintaining the facade of our happy marriage. When confronted with the evidence, Richard claimed the transfers were standard financial planning, unrelated to Hannah. But his explanation couldn't account for the timing or the secrecy. Hannah continued her campaign to contact me, leaving voicemails and sending texts that vacillated between tearful apologies and subtle victim positioning. "I never meant for this to happen," one message began. "Richard and I connected in a way I didn't expect. I still care about Thomas, but these feelings can't be denied." I deleted her messages without responding. Her pregnancy progressed while our divorce dragged on, her social media carefully curated to present herself as a young woman facing challenges with grace rather than a person who had actively participated in destroying a family. Community judgment was swift and often misdirected. At a charity event I attended for professional reasons, I overheard whispers, "That's Abigail Peterson. Her husband left her for their son's girlfriend." So sad. The narrative that Richard had simply fallen in love with a younger woman, rather than betrayed his son in the most fundamental way possible, seemed easier for people to accept than the ugly truth. Thomas faced his own version of this distortion. "People keep saying how hard this must be losing my fiancé to my dad," he told me bitterly, as if this was some kind of fair competition that Dad won, not a complete violation of trust. By the 4th month of separation, I hit my emotional rock bottom. The legal battles, community gossip, and constant navigation of other people's reactions to our family tragedy left me depleted. One Sunday morning, I couldn't get out of bed, the weight of everything that had happened pinning me beneath the covers. Lauren found me there hours later, still in pajamas, staring at the ceiling. "Enough," she said firmly, opening my curtains to let in the sunlight I'd been avoiding. "You've given them enough power. It's time to reclaim your life, Abby." She was right. I had allowed Richard and Hannah's actions to define me, to reduce me to the role of victim in their sordid drama. That day marked a turning point, the moment I decided to transform from the woman who had been betrayed into the woman who refused to be broken. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with small steps. First, attending therapy sessions with Dr. Rivera, a compassionate but no-nonsense psychologist specializing in betrayal trauma. "What you're experiencing is a form of PTSD," she explained during our initial session. "The discovery of infidelity, particularly of this nature, creates neurological responses similar to physical danger." Understanding the science behind my emotional pain somehow made it more manageable. This wasn't weakness or overreaction. It was my brain and body responding normally to extreme betrayal. Dr. Rivera guided me through exercises to process the trauma without allowing it to define me. "Richard and Hannah's actions reveal their character, not your worth," she reminded me often. Alongside therapy, I began reconnecting with passions I'd neglected during my marriage. I joined a local photography club, reviving an interest that had once brought me joy before family responsibilities took precedence. The focus required for composition and lighting techniques forced my mind away from rumination about the past. I reached out to college friends I'd lost touch with over the years. Melissa, my freshman roommate who now lived just 30 minutes away, invited me to her book club. The 6 women there knew nothing about my situation, treating me as Abigail the person rather than Abigail the betrayed wife. Professionally, I channeled my energy into my real estate career with renewed focus. My broker Samantha noticed the change immediately. "Whatever fire's been lit under you, keep it burning," she said after I secured 3 new listings in 2 weeks. "You're working with an intensity I haven't seen before." The truth was, work provided structure when everything else felt chaotic. The concrete steps of property marketing, client meetings, and closings gave me control in a life that had spun dramatically off course. Thomas watched my gradual rebuilding with a mixture of pride and concern. "You're doing better than I am," he admitted one evening as we shared takeout in my apartment. "I'm just better at faking it," I responded with a half smile. "And I've got about 15 years of life experience on you. It helps." His own healing process was complicated by the approaching birth of his father's child with his ex-fiancée, a permanent living reminder of their betrayal. He'd committed to his deferred medical school acceptance, focusing on that future rather than the painful present. 3 months into my separation, I met with Patricia Winters, a financial advisor Lauren had recommended. What began as a consultation about securing my financial future post-divorce led to an unexpected revelation. "I'd like to review your husband's business assets more thoroughly," Patricia said, frowning at her computer screen. "Something seems off in these reports." "Off how?" I asked, leaning forward. "There are discrepancies in the firm's declared earnings versus their client portfolio value. It could be nothing but—" "Richard's firm is being audited," I said slowly, remembering fragments of late-night phone calls I'd overheard in the months before discovering the affair. He said it was routine, but he seemed stressed. Patricia's expression turned serious. "Let me do some digging. If there are financial improprieties, you'll want to distance yourself legally before any findings become public." Working with Janet and Patricia, I discovered Richard's accounting firm was indeed under investigation for irregularities in client tax strategies. Nothing had been proven, but the evidence suggested Richard and several partners had been using questionable methods to help wealthy clients avoid tax obligations. This could explain the timing of his personal decisions, Janet suggested delicately. People often engage in destructive behaviors when under extreme stress. The revelation didn't excuse Richard's betrayal, but it added context to his increasingly erratic behavior before I discovered the affair. It also explained the urgent funds transfers Janet had uncovered, not just preparation for a potential divorce, but protection against possible professional penalties. Armed with this knowledge, Janet adjusted our divorce strategy. "We need to ensure you're insulated from any professional repercussions he might face," she explained, "and we can use this information to negotiate a more favorable settlement." Thomas was thriving despite everything, channeling his pain into preparation for medical school. "I'm not going to let them derail my future," he told me with quiet determination. I supported his decision to maintain absolute no contact with both Richard and Hannah, even as Hannah's due date approached. She had sent him a sonogram image with a note saying, "This may not be what we planned, but this baby is still connected to you." Thomas had returned the envelope unopened. My new support network expanded beyond Lauren to include other women navigating major life transitions. Brenda, recently widowed, Keisha changing careers at 45, Elena starting over after her own divorce. Our Saturday morning coffee meetings became anchors in my week, reminders that rebuilding was possible. The woman in the mirror began to change too. The hollow-eyed, shell-shocked person from the early days after discovery gradually gave way to someone with clearer eyes and straighter shoulders. I cut my hair, donated the clothes that reminded me of my married life, and slowly built a wardrobe that reflected who I was becoming rather than who I had been. Richard noticed the change during a required mediation session. his eyes widening slightly when I entered the room. "You look different," he said, sounding surprised. "I am different," I replied simply. As Hannah's pregnancy progressed into its final trimester, Richard's attempts to reconcile intensified, perhaps realizing the permanence of the situation he'd created. His calls became more frequent, his tone more desperate. "We could still work this out," he insisted during one call I accidentally answered. "For Thomas's sake, for our history together." "Our history is exactly why we can't work it out," I responded. 20 years together means you knew exactly what you were destroying when you chose to betray me and our son. The most significant aspect of my transformation wasn't external but internal. The gradual reclamation of my sense of self-worth, independent of my roles as wife and mother. The betrayal had initially shattered my identity, but in gathering the pieces, I was creating something new and unexpectedly stronger. 6 months after discovering Richard and Hannah together, I no longer cried myself to sleep. I no longer flinched when seeing happy couples or engagement announcements. I was building a life that wasn't defined by what had been done to me, but by what I was choosing to do next. And what came next would surprise everyone, especially Richard and Hannah. The birth of Hannah and Richard's daughter coincided almost exactly with the finalization of our divorce. The timing seemed fitting, one relationship officially ending as the physical evidence of their betrayal entered the world. Thomas learned about his half-sister's arrival from a mutual friend who hadn't realized the sensitivity of the situation. He sat silently on my couch. After receiving the text, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" I asked gently, giving him space to process. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," he admitted. "Angry, sad. It's not the baby's fault, but every time I think about her existence—" "You don't have to figure it out right now," I assured him. "Or ever really. Your feelings are valid, whatever they are." The divorce settlement was finalized largely in my favor, due in part to Richard's infidelity, but also significantly impacted by Janet's discovery of his financial maneuvers and the looming professional investigation. The judge had little sympathy for a man who had betrayed both his wife and son while potentially engaging in professional impropriety. I received our family home, which I promptly sold half of Richard's retirement account's substantial alimony and a percentage of his business interests, considerably more than his initial generous offer. The victory felt hollow in some ways. No amount of money could compensate for the family we'd lost, but the financial security provided a foundation for rebuilding. What Richard hadn't anticipated was that during the divorce proceedings, I had been quietly documenting evidence of potential financial improprieties at his firm. Not out of vengeance, but out of a sense of ethical responsibility and self-protection. "If the firm faces sanctions, you could be implicated if you've benefited from these practices even unknowingly," Janet had explained. "We need to establish your separation from these activities." The documentation I'd gathered was submitted to the appropriate regulatory authorities as part of my legal insulation strategy. 3 weeks after our divorce was finalized, Richard's firm announced it was cooperating with a formal investigation into tax strategy practices. Richard called me in a panic. "Did you know about this? Did you have something to do with this?" I protected myself. I answered truthfully. "Something you taught me to do through your example." The professional consequences for Richard mounted quickly. Several prestigious clients withdrew from the firm. Partners distanced themselves from the strategies under investigation. Richard's professional reputation, built over decades, began crumbling under scrutiny. Meanwhile, Hannah's new mother glow faded rapidly as the realities of her situation set in. Richard, now financially constrained by the divorce settlement and legal fees from the investigation, couldn't provide the lifestyle she had perhaps envisioned. Their relationship, built on deception and betrayal, struggled under the weight of a newborn and public scrutiny. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned they were living in Richard's downtown condo, Hannah growing increasingly resentful of being sidelined in Richard's life and isolated from her former friends, most of whom had sided with Thomas after learning of the betrayal. The paternity test confirming Richard as the father had been a formality, but its official documentation forced him to acknowledge legal responsibility for the child. Child support payments further strained his already compromised finances. Thomas maintained his boundary of no contact with both of them, focusing instead on his first semester of medical school. He had moved into student housing near the university, establishing his independence while still visiting me regularly. Hannah tried to contact me again, he mentioned during Sunday dinner at my new home, a charming townhouse I'd purchased with part of the divorce settlement. She sent pictures of the baby, said she's named her Lily. "What did you do?" I asked, careful to keep my tone neutral. "Nothing. Deleted the email without responding." He shrugged, but I could see the pain beneath the casual gesture. "What's the point? That child is my father's responsibility, not mine." I had purchased my dream home independently, a 3-bedroom townhouse in a vibrant neighborhood with a small garden and modern kitchen. The space was entirely mine, decorated to my taste, without compromising with anyone else's preferences. For the first time in decades, I made decisions based solely on what I wanted. My professional life flourished. I was named Realtor of the Year at our agency's annual awards recognition of both my sales performance and client satisfaction ratings. The plaque sat prominently on my office wall, tangible proof that I was more than the woman who had been betrayed. Thomas thrived in medical school, his natural intelligence and work ethic earning him top marks despite the emotional trauma he'd endured. He began dating again cautiously, a psychology student named Amber, who knew his story and respected his need for honesty and clear boundaries. I found myself unexpectedly enjoying the company of James Morrison, a widower I met through a charity fundraiser for the hospital. Our first coffee meeting extended into lunch, our conversation flowing effortlessly. Unlike the few awkward dates I'd endured since the divorce, nothing with James felt forced or performative. "I'm not looking to replace Margaret," he told me candidly, referring to his late wife. "But I've learned life is too short not to connect with people who make it brighter." The sentiment resonated deeply. I wasn't looking to replace the life I'd had with Richard. That chapter was closed. But I was open to writing something new. 8 months after Hannah gave birth, their relationship with Richard began publicly deteriorating. Hannah's social media shifted from carefully crafted family imagery to vague posts about disappointment and feeling trapped. Richard, now working reduced hours as the investigation into his firm continued, was seen arguing with her at a restaurant by mutual acquaintances. "She expected him to leave you and create this perfect new family," Lauren reported after running into them. "Now she's realizing she's just the younger woman who destroyed a family for a man who isn't what she thought." The community perception had shifted dramatically. Initially viewed with pity as the abandoned wife, I was now seen as someone who had handled devastating circumstances with dignity. Richard and Hannah, initially viewed by some as a love story, overcoming social conventions, were increasingly perceived as the architects of unnecessary pain. A year to the day after discovering them together, Richard appeared at my door unannounced. He looked diminished, thinner, grayer, the confident posture replaced by a slight stoop. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual assurance. I considered turning him away, but decided closure might be beneficial for my ongoing healing. Briefly, I agreed, leaving the door open but not inviting him further than the entryway. "I made the biggest mistake of my life," he began without preamble. "Hannah's leaving, taking Lily to Colorado to live with her parents. She says I'm not the man she thought I was." He laughed bitterly. "Apparently, I'm too old, too preoccupied with the investigation, not attentive enough." I waited, saying nothing. "I've lost everything that matters," he continued. "My son won't speak to me. My daughter's being taken across the country. My career is in shambles. And I lost you, the only woman who ever truly knew and loved me." "What do you want, Richard?" I asked directly. "A second chance." He looked up, eyes pleading. "We had 20 good years. We could try again for Thomas's sake, if nothing else." I studied the man I had once loved beyond reason, the father of my child. my partner through early struggles and later success. I felt no anger, no hatred, just a profound absence of connection. No, I said simply, what we had is gone. You didn't just betray me, Richard. You betrayed our family, our history, our son. Some things can't be undone. I still love you, he insisted, stepping toward me. No, you don't, I replied with certainty. You love the idea of me, the wife who organized your life, supported your career, raised your child, and tolerated your self-importance. That woman doesn't exist anymore. I've become someone else, someone who wouldn't choose you. His face crumpled briefly before hardening. You've changed. Yes, I agreed. That's what healing looks like. After Richard left, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine, feeling strangely peaceful. The encounter had confirmed what I'd begun to understand through months of therapy and self-reflection. Forgiveness didn't require reconciliation. I could release the anger without re-engaging with its source. The following week, Hannah reached out one final time before moving to Colorado. Her message was the first that contained what seemed like genuine remorse rather than self-justification. I won't ask for forgiveness, because what we did is unforgivable, she wrote. But I want you to know I recognize the pain we caused. I'll make sure Lily knows Thomas as her brother someday if he ever wants that relationship. I'm sorry, truly. I didn't respond directly, but I forwarded the message to Thomas, adding only, for when or if you're ready, no pressure either way. The holiday season arrived, bringing with it new traditions. Thomas brought Amber to Thanksgiving dinner at my townhouse, where Lauren's family and James joined us. The table was filled with laughter and warmth, a different kind of family than I'd imagined, but no less meaningful. Richard spent the holiday alone, according to mutual friends. Hannah was in Colorado with her parents and Lily. The consequences of their choices continued to unfold in ways neither had anticipated. As for me, I had discovered something profound through the painful journey of the past year. Betrayal could break you open, but what grew from that breaking could be stronger, more authentic, and ultimately more fulfilling than what was lost. I looked around at the mismatched family we'd created at my holiday table. My son finding joy again, friends who had become family, new love blooming cautiously with James, and realized that sometimes the most devastating endings make possible the most beautiful beginnings. Have you ever experienced a betrayal that eventually led to something better in your life? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if you found strength in my journey from heartbreak to healing, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share with someone who might need to hear that life after betrayal isn't just possible, it can be beautiful. Thank you for letting me share my story with you today. Remember, sometimes the most painful endings clear the way for unexpectedly wonderful new chapters.